All right, it's 4:01, so we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, welcome back. And if this is your first time joining us, my name is Logan Johnson. I'm the Northeast Region Coordinator for the Forest Stewards Guild. I want to welcome you to the second section of our Oak mini-series for forest landowners, where today we'll focus on forestry. Throughout the presentation, please feel free to use the chat window to submit your questions, which we will save for the question and answer portion of the event in the last half hour. I'd like to introduce our today's speaker, Fern Graves, who is the Principal Forester and Stewardship Program Coordinator for the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management, Division of Forest Environment. So I will stop sharing my screen and Fern, you can take it away.
All right. Thank you, Logan. If at any point the slides get out of whack, please someone stop me. So forest management in the context of oak resiliency. Whoops, there we go. All right. So I want to talk about our historic forests in southern New England for a minute here. This image on the left is from a paper that a group of researchers did to try to reconstruct what our historic forest composition might have looked like. This is really difficult to say definitively. There are lots of things we can look at. We can look at primary sources, that's like journals, diaries, letters, even literature as secondary sources. But this particular paper was really interesting because what they looked at was witness trees. A lot of you probably know what those are, but for those of you that don't, when land was parceled out during colonial settlement, there would have been bounds bounding the parcels. These could have been particular geological features or stone piles of stones. You find a lot of old drill holes in stone walls and granite. And a lot of these bounds were trees. So it would say, go 35 feet to this tree, then changing direction at this angle, go this many feet to the beech tree here. We don't have a lot of those trees left. So a lot of that parcel data is, you still find it in people's properties. You find it in the historic documents, but the trees are very rarely there. But anyway, Cogbill and his associates looked at all of this data, huge amount of data. And using the species of the witness trees, they kind of reconstructed what the common species would be and in what kinds of proportions they would be. So if you look at southern New England here, you see that our forest is in the past, historic pre-settlement or during settlement. Oak was a huge component. The forest type would have likely been oak, chestnut, hickory in a lot of southern New England. And this seems pretty accurate knowing what we know about the soils and about forest types that we can grow now here. Of course, we lost the chestnut to blight over 100 years ago, which is around that time, which is probably one of the greatest ecological tragedies in the eastern forests. Chestnut would have been a big component. We don't have chestnut anymore. You can see while most of southern New England is that oak, hickory, chestnut forest type back then, when you get up into the west and the north, you start to get a lot more pine. So up in the west and the north of southern New England, that's going to be white pine. Towards the coastal areas, that's probably going to be a lot more pitch pine. Interestingly, Cape Cod's composition has changed very little. You can't really see it behind my key in the history, but today it's still a lot of pitch pine and oak. The picture on the right it's from FIA data, that's Forest Inventory Analysis run by the Forest Service. And that's our composition of forests today. You can see we've got a lot more red maple and a lot more of that white pine component has moved down into southern New England where it used to be more oak, hickory, chestnut. But we still do have quite a bit of oak there making up that composition. And what happened between these two is that southern New England was almost completely cleared for agriculture. The only places that would not have been completely cleared are probably certain wetlands and certain areas of disputed property. Most of what we have today is what we would call secondary forest. Very little old growth, very little of what kind of forest composition we would have had back then. So we're going to talk about kind of why the species composition changed as we go into what makes a forest. But keep this in mind, and I will come back to it um, at the end so that we can bring it all together. So I'm going to talk about this word silvics. Silvics is a special term we use that basically just means ecological characteristics of tree species. There's a longer definition. It's not that important. It's not that much better than the short version. Every species of trees has different ecological characteristics, different silvics. And when we talk about these characteristics, these are what makes them able to grow, where they grow, and how they grow. And a lot of what determines this, we'll talk about it in terms of tolerance, of what the tree tolerates. So we do this for a reason. Most trees will grow on the very best sites. You don't find every species of tree on the very best sites. If you have two sites, one that is a perfect site with perfect soils and nutrients and water, and you have a very poor site with the opposite of that, and you throw a bunch of tree species in these sites. On the best site, all things being equal, what's going to grow there is the trees that grow fastest. They're going to outcompete everything else every time. They have plenty of resources. They're the best competitors. On the poorer site, what's going to grow there is whatever can tolerate those conditions, whether it's too wet, too dry. So we talk about it in terms of tolerance because what determines where trees grow is not what they like, it's what they can tolerate. So some of the bigger determinants are going to be things like shade tolerance. So some trees need full sunlight. Think about our cedars, eastern red cedar, Atlantic white cedar, which Atlantic white cedar is interesting. It's very shade intolerant up here. So silvics are generally regional. They can be different in a different region with a different climate. But up here, those are very, very shade intolerant. So you'll get eastern red cedar in an old field. It'll be one of the first things that comes in. And the minute it gets shade on it, it'll start to decline and die. And that is because it is intolerant of shade. The other end of the spectrum, you have species like hemlock and red maple, which will start out in the understory. They're pretty tolerant of shade. They'll hang out there for a very long time and they will not die because they can tolerate that shade. They can survive there. They would do better with more sunlight, but they tolerate the lack of sunlight much better than other species would. And this is on a gradient. So you'll have intolerant, you'll have a range of moderate tolerances, and you will have tolerant. So these are words that I'm going to use throughout this. And remember, it's kind of a spectrum. Fire response and fire tolerance. Some trees will not be killed by a low intensity fire and some will. Now, the tolerance of fire is different than the response. So thicker barked species tend to be tolerant of fire. Thinner barked species tend to be intolerant of fire. And trees then have different responses to fire. So if a tree is top killed, that is, if everything above the ground is killed, some species will sprout back very vigorously after a fire, which is really important. And some species won't. If a white pine gets killed by fire, it's not coming back. And site conditions. Some trees tolerate really wet, swampy conditions. Some trees tolerate really dry conditions. Some trees won't tolerate any of that and they need the perfect conditions. And some trees tolerate a wide range of these soil conditions. And this can include soil quality, it can include moisture availability, it can include the aspects of which direction is the slope facing. Is it south facing or north facing? What is the quality of light that it's getting? These are what we're thinking about with site condition and tolerances of those different characteristics. So here's a little chart with all of our very common oak species that we're going to be managing for. It's not all of our oak species, it's the most common and the ones that we generally manage. And again, this is, when we talk about tolerances, This is at the scale of the whole species. So you can have outliers of individuals, but in general, the pattern is going to be this. Um, we have two major groups of oaks, the white oaks and the red oaks. The red oaks all kind of hybridize quite readily. White oaks will to some degree, depending on the species. Red oaks can be, you can get some real mixed up ones. But in general, if you look at the patterns, a lot of our oak species are going to be fairly shade tolerant, moderately tolerant, different degrees. So that lighter green over there, those red oaks, those are going to be a little on the less tolerant end of moderate, and our white oaks are going to be on the more tolerant end of moderate. But this is very dependent on the tree's age. So as seedlings, they're more tolerant than as adults. So as they grow, that tolerance is going to go down. Seedlings can hang out in the understory a little bit, but as they start to get up in the intermediate crown, moving towards the overstory, they're going to be much less tolerant of shade. Fire is another important one. Moderate fire tolerances for a lot of our oaks, some of them not so much. And it makes sense if you can picture the bark of these species. So white oak has this classic layered plates of bark, kind of thick. Chestnut oak has these big, thick blocks of bark that go up the tree. Black oak also has blocky bark, not quite to the same extent as chestnut oak, but this thick, blocky or platy bark insulates the very delicate living part of the tree from a fire that would come through. And this would have to be a lower intensity fire. Obviously, if you get a huge wildfire through there, not a lot is going to survive. But in general, these species can tolerate fire because of their bark. Northern red oak and scarlet oak have much thinner bark. The older the trees get, the more fire tolerant they will be, though. Some very old northern red oaks can certainly tolerate fire much better than younger ones. As far as site conditions go, they tolerate a lot of things. You don't have to know all of this. I put it here so you can see how different each species is. So they all kind of have their own little niches where they would grow. And oftentimes you do find them together. You find mixtures of different oak species. I'd like to point out chestnut oak is a very interesting one. And again, this is regional. So in the southern New England region, in most of the southern New England region, you find chestnut oaks in very specific sites. You find them on ridges because chestnut oak tolerates really poor soil conditions. They tolerate fires that might come through. They can tolerate these really steep slopes that a lot of trees just can't deal with. But they will grow much better in really nice soils. So if you've ever been to Pennsylvania, there's certain sort of sloping wetlands in a lot of Pennsylvania with really rich soils. And you will see the most beautiful big chestnut oaks you've ever seen in your life. You don't get that in a lot of southern New England. You get them on ridge tops. If you like hiking and you're interested in seeing kind of a classic chestnut oak ridge forest type, in Rhode Island, there's the George B. Parker Preserve off of 102. And the trail's about 8 miles, but once you get about 3 miles in, maybe a little more, you can see this perfect example of this forest type. It is very interesting, in my opinion. Some people might not think it's so much, but that's just an example of how tolerance determines where tree species are going to grow. So when you look at this and you think of this pattern kind of emerging, what you get is in general, these oaks have this moderate shade tolerance that starts to decline as they grow, and a moderate fire tolerance with a robust sprouting response. So if an oak tree gets top killed by fire, it will sprout quite readily in general. The second thing you want to think about when you're thinking about silvics is disturbance. Disturbance is what shapes our forests, what shapes the silvic characteristics respond to disturbances. In southern New England, our disturbances would be things like storms, native insect events. Obviously now we deal with non-native insect events as well, which is also a disturbance, and fire. So our historic fire return interval, which would be how frequently fires would come through, in much of southern New England would have been around 30 years, sometimes even more frequently in certain sites, which is fairly frequent. And these fires would have been lower intensity because there wouldn't be a lot of time for fuels to build up. So you would have fires coming through every few decades or so that would be taking out underbrush. They would be taking out dead material. And this would be a cycle that would be feeding into how these forests would grow. So you can see how this would keep out the maple. If you remember that first graphic I showed you, maple does not respond to fire. So the maple would largely be confined to wetlands where it would not be affected by fire. And then the species that would tolerate a fire every now and then, a lot of oak, hickory, or chestnut, would be doing all right. So we need to put these puzzle pieces together. And the way I'm explaining it is a lot more simplified than how these dynamics actually work. But just to kind of give you the idea of how things fit together, it's a little less complicated than what's actually happening. So if you have a forest in southern New England here, different size classes is what we would call them. So you have some trees up in the overstory, that's the tallest trees. You have a few trees, a couple in the mid-story. Those are the ones that are growing towards the overstory. And then you have some small trees, seedlings and saplings in the understory here. So you have your forest, a lot of species. You have a pine tree in there, probably birch and a maple coming in. Your oaks have been making acorns. You have a seedling coming up. That seedling's going to be doing all right, tolerating the shade. It'll start to grow and it'll start to get less tolerant. And this will start to put it into decline because it can't tolerate as much shade. Then perhaps you have a storm that comes in. Storm knocks over one of the overstory trees, and this creates a gap that allows light into the forest. Now, every tree that is down there is suddenly going to be competing for that light. So the trees that grow faster are going to start to outcompete. Maple grows pretty fast under certain conditions. It might outcompete the oak, maybe. Some brushy shrubs might outcompete the oak. A few years later, you might get a fire that comes through, a lightning strike, or indigenous people might have started a fire. And it'll come through and it will kill the thin-barked species, top kill them. It will kill things like white pine, it will kill red maple, it will kill birch. And it might top kill some of the younger oak species, which will then resprout. But that allows those oak trees that are hanging out in the mid-story that might be able to survive a low intensity fire, they'll be able to take advantage of that because now their competition is all out of the way and they'll start to grow. We call these gap dynamics when we talk about these single trees or a small group of trees falling or succumbing to disturbance and this sort of competitive reaction in the understory. So we want to manage this, taking these things into account. There are two, I won't say schools because every forester uses both types of management. So there's passive management and active management. Passive management relies solely on natural processes. You're not doing anything. There's no human involvement that is planned or sanctioned. Obviously, you can have, people come in, there's timber theft, there's fires that are started by people, by neighbors that might happen. But in general, what you're doing is not managing the forest. You want these natural processes to be the ones that are shaping what's happening. But when you do this, you want to use this in specific circumstances. So when you manage forests, you want to identify the ecosystem services that you want to promote. Ecosystem services is lots of things. Forests provide a lot of different services. Water and air quality protection, wildlife habitat, and carbon sequestration is a big one. And it's often the one we talk about when we talk about passive management. That carbon capture and storage that trees do and that the soils underneath them do. So you would use passive management if you had an old growth forest. There are very few of those and they're inherently valuable. You would use passive management if you have a forest that is performing its crucial ecosystem services to a high degree, and nothing you will do is going to make it much better. In fact, if you did something, it would be more detrimental than positive. Active management is what you more commonly see when we talk about forestry. So we're still identifying crucial ecosystem services that we want our forests to perform and that they're capable of performing. But these forests might not be anywhere close to what they could be. So what we're going to do is we're going to mimic natural processes. We're going to mimic disturbances using what we know about the silvics of the trees that are there or the trees we want to be there. And we will use this to shape how the forest is. So it's more what we're doing and what we're envisioning than just letting natural processes shape it. So you would use this in situations where the forest is compromised. So we're currently living in the anthropocene age. This is a fancy word that just means human age. This means that humans have affected nearly every ecosystem on the planet. Every ecosystem, if you consider the effects of climate change. There's not a single part of the world that is not affected by us. Some systems are more affected than others. New England has had, huge effects. None of our forests are anything like what they used to be in southern New England. So it's hard when you think about what we've been given, what we have now due to past human action and human interference and how humans have shaped what we now have to work with. So how do we promote forest resiliency with all of that interference, with all of that human action that's affecting everything? And it's hard. So when we manage for a resilient forest, what we really want is a forest capable of sustaining native species. And when I say native species, I'm not just talking about trees. I'm talking about understory plants, and I'm talking about animals. Animals are just as much a part of a forest ecosystem as plants, and they're a very important part of what we manage. And then those ecosystem services that are being provided by the forest. This is not a textbook definition. This is my personal definition and what I would look at. I'm sure every forester has a different answer for this, which is fine. So when we passively manage for this resilience, for these native ecosystems, native species with those ecosystem services, we want, in general, vigorously growing trees, or at least trees that are not in decline overall. So a forester would look at how they're growing. They would look at their structure, their height. They would look at the crown to make sure that, in general, a forest is healthy. Death is just as much a part of a forest as life. So just because there are dead trees in a forest does not mean that forest is unhealthy. You should, in fact, have some dead trees in a forest. So when I say this, take it with a little grain of salt. You want native vegetation. You don't want any invasive species in there competing with the native species, because most of our invasive species will outcompete the native species. Now, when I say invasive species, I mean exotic invasive species, but specifically. There are exotic species that aren't invasive. So if you have like a crepe myrtle in your yard, it's not going to get into your forest and cause havoc. These are very specific species. Things like Japanese barberry is one of the worst. Burning bush, multiflora rose, these kinds of really noxious things that will get in and take over. And you want low browsing pressure. Wildlife is a really important part of the forest, but you don't want it to be affecting the plant part of the forest more than the plant part of the forest is capable of sustaining over time. You want low instance of diseases and harmful insects. Just because there are beetles in your trees does not mean they are harmful to your whole forest. Again, death is part of the forest as well. Now, if something is out of balance, then the disease and insects might not be at the point where you want them to be, and that is a problem. So this is something that you would kind of want to monitor, and you want beneficial insects to be present. Insects are the building block of almost every single ecosystem. If you don't have insects in your forest, then there is a very big problem. You want appropriate density and structure. So the right number of trees that are appropriate for the site, for the species. You don't want anything to be too overcrowded. Although if you're passively managing, in a lot of species, trees will start out overcrowded, and that's perfectly natural. And they will sort of compete with each other, and they'll self-weed themselves out. That's normal. You don't have to interfere with that. It's passive management. Nature will take care of it. But you always want to be monitoring results. If you've decided to passively manage something, you need to be constantly monitoring it, because if something happens and things get out of balance and those ecosystem services start to decline for whatever reason, it might require just a little bit of active management, just a little bit maybe sometimes. But you always want to be monitoring. You never want to just ignore a forest. It doesn't matter if you're letting nature take its course. Pay attention. Active management is a little more active. So you will eradicate invasive species, or in a lot of cases, eradication is not possible, or not possible in a specific time frame. So you would want to control invasive species. This would mean making sure they're not spreading, making sure the fruit doesn't go anywhere, keeping them under control until the point where you can start to do some eradication. Using silvics to understand your species, using silvics to understand what kind of disturbances you want to mimic and in what patterns. You want to promote native wildlife. You always want wildlife in your forests. They do so many important things that add to those ecosystem services, including insects. And you want to promote native understory plants. Just like a forest is not just plants, a forest is not just trees. You need to have these native understory plants. They're incredibly important to the ecosystem as a whole. I'm particularly fond of spring ephemerals. Trout lilies and skunk cabbage are my absolute favorites. You want these things in your forest. You want shrubs in your forests, all kinds of these things. It's very important to that overall ecosystem services we're talking about in an oak forest. Again, as with passive management, you really want to be aware of threats that are around you. You want to be aware if something gets into the country, you want to know where it is, if it's nearby, a disease, an insect, because the more you know, the better you are prepared to take steps. Emerald ash borer, it doesn't attack oak trees. It doesn't affect oak forests very much, but it's one of those things where if you know it's coming ahead of time, you can take steps to make decisions. Gypsy moth is something we know affects our oak forests, and we can make certain decisions based on where it is. Although it's less predictable than some of the other insects, because it's not 100% here or there, and it comes in these cycles that we don't really understand completely, or can't really predict, especially with climate change, because that has very much affected our rain cycles and drought cycles, which do affect the gypsy moth populations. And you want to be monitoring results. Always be monitoring your forests. It's very important. So I'm going to come back to this graphic. So now that we've talked about species, silvics characteristics, where in our historic forests, you see you had very small instances of maple. Those were in wetlands generally, because red maple tolerates really, really swampy soils that not a lot of tree species tolerate. And in our modern forests, you see a lot more of those. A lot of that is due to the fact that red maple, prolific seed, makes a lot of seed. The seed travels very well by wind. and it is shade tolerant. So what happens is these red maples are seeding in to forest understories, and they're doing quite well there without disturbance or interference. And that is one of the major effects that we're currently getting. There are, this is very simplified. There are lots of other characteristics that are feeding into this. So um, it's not just that, but that's just an example to kind of give you an idea of how our forests are changing and why post-colonial agricultural clearing. And that's all I had to talk about. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Oh.
Thank you very much, Fern. That was a great presentation. Learned a lot. I know I did. We have a few questions coming in. The first one that popped in the chat window a minute ago, I think is a good one to start with. What do you mean when you monitor your forest? I think referring to the passive management side.
Sure. So when you're passively managing, just like when you're actively managing, you need to have goals. With passive management, it would be the kinds of ecosystem services that you want it to perform. So when you monitor, what you're doing is basically looking for certain characteristics of the forest that would indicate what kind of ecosystem services it's performing. So you would want to make sure, for instance, that you're not getting invasive species coming in there. This is a big one with monitoring that a lot of people have to do because there are invasive species everywhere. If you're passively managing, you don't want invasive species to come into your forest because they are going to wreck the ecosystem and compromise those services. So that's one example, but there's lots of things you would be keeping an eye out on. Forest health in general, how robust your species are, how healthy they seem to be. So it's really goal dependent.
Great, thank you. And I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge Andrea Urbano as our second panelist to help answer our questions here. Moving quickly into the next one, what insects or diseases will harm my oak trees, and how do I prevent them from spreading in my forest?
There are a lot of pests, both non-native and native, that are going to go after oak. Non-native, of course, gypsy moth. Winter moth, not so much in oaks, but it can be found in oaks sometimes. There are a lot of native species as well that you will see. Forest tent caterpillar has been known to really ramp up, and a lot of the environmental like low moisture, drought, the kinds of things that support gypsy moth infestations are the same kinds of things that are going to support forest tent caterpillars. So the fungus that controls gypsy moth, there's a fungus that controls forest tent caterpillar. And if things are dry, forest tent caterpillar is going to be there too. It's native. It's always been here. There's orange striped oakworm. This one's very interesting. So our native species have evolved with our native species of trees. So orange striped oakworm actually attacks oak species at the end of the growing season. So really, in an ideal situation, they would eat the leaves at the end of the growing season, and the oak would be done for the growing season. That's it. So just a little bit of extra time that they might have had to do photosynthesis they no longer have, which doesn't really compromise the trees. When gypsy moth comes in, they denude the trees. The trees flesh out a second time because it's early in the season. And then the orange striped oakworm will come in and denude it a second time, which is, I mean, the tree can really not handle that kind of stress twice in a year. It's very difficult. So you can see how these native and non-native feed into each other and cause a problem. As to how you can prevent these things, you can't really, unfortunately. What you can do is work to make your forest as healthy as they can be. So you want species that are appropriate to the site. You want a good species mix. And this might require active management to do, and it might require that you don't have quite the same composition of oak species that you might want. You might need a little more of other species in there. I'm sure other foresters, if Andrea wants to add anything, have other ideas. But in general, it's very difficult to completely control those things because there's just not really a way.
Yes, Fern, I would echo everything you said. You answered that question really well. I might just add, there are things that affect oaks when they're stressed from drought, like Fern referenced, and then also quite the opposite when there's too much moisture, like anthracnose effects. That's a disease, a pathogen, fungal pathogen. There's armillaria root rot. But then moisture can help in the soil, can help regulate the gypsy moth population because there's a soil-borne fungus that acts as a pathogen to that. There's oak wilt, which more commonly affects red oaks than white oaks. So one thing you can kind of do, I guess, through management is help diversify or maintain representation of oaks in both the red oak and white oak families if you have them, so that you kind of wage your bets, I guess, or hedge your losses, whatever that expression is, where some things might not affect each individual oak species. But as Fern said, like, our systems are adapted to these types of biotic disturbances, insects and disease. It helps in a healthy system promote mortality, which, as Fern also said, is important. It's an important component of forest health to a certain extent. It's when we add things like climate change that totally offsets the normal functions of our systems, where insects and diseases have a more impactful role where our forests cannot recover. So monitoring is key, because if you see or if you hear from your forester friends that gypsy moths are going to be bad this year, there might be some active forms of management you can take to reduce the impact that might have. For example, promote some stump sprouts, cutting trees between 6 and 14 inches in diameter, not all of them, but some, to get some advanced regeneration on the ground, because those sprouts are at less of a risk to be affected by gypsy moth than mature trees, just as an example. So if you see something happening, call your service forester or any forester you may know, and they can help guide what practices you can implement to reduce the risks.
Great, thank you both. And this next question dovetails in with that nicely and was asked by a registrant before the session in the Zoom registration. How do I deal with the impacts of gypsy moths 3 to 4 years later, with an emphatic ugh at the end?
Well, that's really going to depend on it's going to be forest specific. So some forests were impacted a lot more than others, especially drier ones. There's some very interesting historical data that shows that what actually caused the mortality of our trees was not just the gypsy moths by themselves. It was the combination of several years of drought. Back in the 80s, there was less drought and less mortality. Of course, the trees were younger then, but historically, this has happened before. There's some very interesting data from like the 1800s about these kinds of things that would happen. And it's drought. And so you might have had a forest that was not as affected, or you might be talking about one where you had 100% mortality, in which case the kinds of things you would do to deal with it, this is not going to be a very fun answer. So what's going to happen in a lot of those cases is that we're going to have a new succession of a completely different forest. You're not going to get your pure oak forest back. You're going to get, depending on where you are, beech. You're going to get maple. You're going to get a lot of white pine. We're going to see a lot of white pine coming in. And the thing to do is to work with that. So you're going to need to manage what you've got in the ways that are appropriate for what it is. And a big part of that is going to be with all the brush and all of this vigorous new growth we're going to get a lot of fire risk, especially with a lot of drought. So that's going to have to be in your management kind of regime as well. I hope that was more of an answer than a non-answer. I don't know if Andrea has anything to add to that.
Well, the answer is, as you said, there's no one size fits all solution. As you said, it is so site specific. And it might be worth mentioning, just in the context of insects and disease and gypsy moth, the two-line chestnut borer, which is actually a native insect, genetically related to the emerald ash borer, but it only targets stress or weakened trees. So with the drought and then the gypsy moth and then the two-line chestnut borer kind of was like took them down. In non-drought and gypsy moth outbreak years, the chestnut borer would not really be a big threat to oak health because they wouldn't be in a compromised state, theoretically. Oaks in wetter soils have done better in these circumstances because they were less affected by the drought. But one thing folks can do if they have a woodlot that has widespread oak mortality in the overstory is if interested, it's not for everybody, but take advantage of the Natural Resource Conservation Services Environmental Quality Incentives Program. In the chat box, I'm sending a link to where you can get the fact sheet and apply for that program. But that is applicable to landowners who want to implement active forestry where it would otherwise be cost prohibitive, meaning you're not going to generate enough income to offset the cost of performing the management. And this has proven to be a very viable option for landowners who are willing to work with the government and receive financial reimbursement, for this type of stewardship. And it generally involves removing some of the dead trees, in the overstory, and maybe doing it in a more strategic way to help promote regeneration of oaks on the landscape.
Great, thank you both. And we want to touch on something that you mentioned in the last question and throughout the presentation, Fern. You mentioned fire in the ecology and silvics section. Is fire a threat to my forest, and are local fire departments prepared to respond if a fire occurs?
Fire is absolutely always a threat, especially if you have drier, droughty soils. One of the things you can do is you can look at historic fire instance on your land. So in Rhode Island, I don't know about Connecticut and Massachusetts, but I have to imagine there's something similar. We have a GIS layer online through Rhode Island GIS that shows historic wildfires. So like the fire that came after the hurricane of 38, I think it was in, well, I guess probably 39. There were fires throughout Rhode Island, and you can see where they were and when they happened that were devastating. They killed people, they destroyed homes. So yes, your forest is at risk. And yes, our fire departments, at least in Rhode Island, are equipped. Our wildland forest fire program through Rhode Island DEM provides local fire departments with equipment such as special hoses that are used in the woods. They provide them with training to respond to wildfires. So in Situate, Rhode Island, about 2 or 3 weeks ago, we had a 40-acre fire right off of 102 and US 6. That's pretty big for the kinds of wildfires that we get. And it was responded to by, I believe, 4 different local fire departments, and they were able to put it out using the equipment that our program provided. And it requires a lot of cooperation. You probably want to figure it out. You can, ask your local fire department. See about, every state has a wildland fire control program. Massachusetts has one, Connecticut has one. They are full of wonderful, capable people. You can find someone to get in contact with who'll be able to provide you information with that. NRCS EQUIP program also provides money to help fire mitigation if your forest is determined to be at risk. So there are a lot of options that you can do. There's a program called FireWise, which is for people who live in the woods, that will help you prepare your house. And it's simple things. It's things like clearing brush away from your house. And this works out in California. There are pictures where wildfires have ripped through neighborhoods, basically, and you can see some houses were almost untouched because they followed these principles. So there are a lot of things you can do, but you need to be active and you need to be paying attention. The 40-acre fire in Rhode Island was started by someone who was burning a brush pile and left. So, make sure your neighbors are kind of with it as well, because most of our wildfires are started by people who deliberately start a fire and then leave. The other major cause of wildfires is along interstates on dry days. You'll get a chain sparking across the interstate. You'll get a fire in the side.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that other than to confirm that Connecticut does have, municipal fire departments are trained in this. There's all of our forestry staff, me included, is trained to respond to wildfires. And many of the municipal, house structural firefighters participate in our specific wildfire training program and even help fight fires out west and in Canada, et cetera. So yes to that in Connecticut. And I would just say, if you have a larger swath of land and you feel, and of course a service forester could always walk your property with you and help identify areas that might be at greater risk than other, because really, you need three things to start a fire: oxygen, heat, and fuel. And so with all of this dead oak, there is a fuel load, but if it's all still standing, that risk is lower than if there are, in addition to that, what are called ladder fuels, or, fine fuels on the ground, like leaf litter, and then shrubs and stuff that can ignite, that kind of helps shoot the flames up into the overstory trees. You can establish like almost walking trails through your woods, these fire breaks that if you rake and remove those fuels, even if there is a fire, you already have established a strong defense line and a break that can help it from spreading. So there are techniques like that you can relatively easily implement on your landscape.
Great, thank you both. It's fascinating. We all are watching the news and see what happens out in the western part of the country, and it's good to know what its context is here in the Northeast. So we appreciate those answers. Moving back into more of the ecology and silviculture, silvics. We have less oak and chestnut in the region, but is having more maple a bad thing? And a similar question to that was also asked. My forest has oaks and maples and other tree species in it. Is it a good idea to favor the oak trees only?
Maple is not a bad thing. Maple is different than what we had, but what we had historically is never going to be here again as long as people are here, because those frequent low intensity fires, we just can't have them at that kind of landscape scale, because it's bad for people. Maple's a perfectly fine tree. It tolerates almost every site you put it on, except for the very driest. It tolerates pollution. Maple's a pretty good tree. You can make syrup with red maple. Not great timber unless you get a really good site for it where it grows nice and straight. But most people in southern New England aren't managing solely for timber anyway. It has food value for birds. With climate change, it's actually probably better. I'm so sorry about my frogs. With climate change, it's probably a lot better to have more diverse forests than otherwise. So I don't know that you would want to necessarily favor the oaks solely, especially when you have something like gypsy moth coming through. If you have a forest that's broken up with other species, that's generally better because it kind of breaks up how they can rip through an area. Um, their gypsy moths will eat maple, but they don't prefer them. The only tree I know for sure that gypsy moths will not touch are the ash species. They will absolutely not eat it under any circumstance. They'll even try pine. They will not even try ash. But everything else they will, though they prefer oak. So it's good to have a diverse structure. The issue comes in when you have a species like white pine where it grows really fast and it's pretty shade tolerant. So it'll get into the understory and then it will outcompete any oaks you're going to get in there. It's good to have a mix sometimes of pine and oak, but you want to kind of work, if you're actively managing, you want to work with the species diversity. So you want to not necessarily favor only oaks, but you want to make sure you're favoring them enough to maintain that really diverse structure, if that makes sense.
Great, thank you. And just to quickly clarify, is it a good idea to favor the oak trees over the maple?
Sometimes that depends on your goals in almost every sense. So you always want to be looking at your goals. If your goals are to grow big deer and that's your only goal, you absolutely want to be favoring oaks. If your goal is to grow oak timber, you absolutely want to be favoring oaks. Um, there are people that manage for white oak to make barrels out of it, in which case they would favor white oak over any other species. So it always depends on your goals. If your goals don't involve things that are oak specific, then it's not necessarily a great idea to favor the oaks over other species. But oaks sometimes need a little more help. So it really depends.
Great, thank you. And we just had a question come up in the chat window. Is there a POC for planting chestnut trees that are resistant to blight? I'm not quite sure what the POC means there.
Is that like procedure?
Sure, let's go with it. And Nancy, point of contact.
Point of contact. You know, I don't. So there are a couple programs that are working on the chestnut. And one of them I think uses a hybrid, and one of them is doing genetic stuff. I don't know about points of contact. I don't know how to get a hold of a tree. I've never tried it. I know of only a couple people that have gotten a hold of one. Maybe someone else knows.
Amanda put in the chat, the American Chestnut Foundation is a leader in all things chestnut and left a link for them there. So if you're interested in chestnut, you can search the American Chestnut Foundation. A couple more questions to close things out. How old and big are the oldest oak trees in southern New England?
Well, for Rhode Island, our state champion tree is poking out into the middle of a very busy highway in Exeter, Rhode Island. It's a very large white oak tree. And it probably used to be a witness tree. So in a couple places you can find along stone walls, you can find really old, they're usually white oaks, and they are very old, a few hundred years. White oaks and oaks in general, white oak and northern red oak tend to be the longest lived here. They can live up to 300 years. After that, it's pushing it. And most of them don't reach that age. It's just like people, people can live into their 90s or above, but most people don't really reach that. I don't know about the other states what their biggest or oldest are.
Thank you. And one more to wrap it up, and maybe we can squeeze another one in. But how do I find a professional to help me manage my forest? So lots of interesting information in the presentation, but how does a landowner make sense of it all?
Your service foresters can help you. You can find that information online, or I think Logan might have our contact information he'll send out. For Rhode Island, I have a list of consulting foresters. You can call them up, figure out the one you like the most, and have them over. And I'm sure Connecticut and
Yep, visit your state's Division of Forestry website, and the directory of certified practitioners would be there. Service forestry program would be there too. And often service foresters are the first step to working with a private consultant, because we have no money in the game, so therefore we have an unbiased opinion. So I do recommend starting with us, but no pressure.
After they work with you, what would kind of the follow-up steps be from there? They get a sense of what their property is like, and then where do you lead them to?
I do visits. You call me, I will come, and then I'll kind of figure out what your goals are and what you might be able to do and what programs you might be able to take advantage of. And then I give you contact information for those people. I'll give you NRCS contact information. I'll give you conservation district contact information, and I will give you consulting forester list. That's basically how it works.
Yep, mine works very similarly. Share with you observations, answer your questions in the woods together, provide you with those unbiased recommendations based on your goals, help you formulate goals if you don't have them. I write up a little report after that so you can have that to reflect on. And then, yeah, connecting you with any other resources, invasive species control methods, things like that. We're kind of like a glorified Google, really, like really connecting the dots to make it as easy for you as possible to steward your woodlot.
Great, thank you both so much. We'll start to wrap things up here now. And I just want to invite everybody back here for our last session in this mini series for landowners. The last session is on climate change, which is happening on Tuesday, May 4th at 4 p.m. And our presenter will be Andrea, who's been a great resource for us as a panelist the first two sessions, and we're looking forward to having her speak on climate change. She's a Central District Forester for the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, or Connecticut DEEP Division of Forestry. And as we'll close all of these sessions out, we just want to thank all of our partners in this project. And I want to highlight the Massachusetts Division of Fisheries and Wildlife, which has now made its appearance on the partners list here on this page. And I will spare you the last 2 minutes and let you enjoy the rest of your evening. So thank you all so much for attending.